I remember the exact moment my world ended. It was a Tuesday in March, and I was sitting in my father's attorney's office, still wearing the black tie I'd chosen for his funeral 3 days earlier. The grief was still fresh, that hollow, nauseating kind that sits behind your sternum and makes breathing feel like work. My father, Raymond Cole, had built his small manufacturing company over 40 years with calloused hands and a stubbornness that his doctors had ultimately failed to outlast. He'd left me everything, the house, the business accounts, and a life insurance policy worth $2.3 million. My wife, Diana, sat beside me in a charcoal blazer, her hand resting on my knee. She was the CEO of her own tech consulting firm, sharp and polished in every room she walked into. She'd held me when I cried after the hospital called. She'd organized the catering for the reception. She'd whispered, "We'll get through this together, Tom," into my hair while I sat on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. unable to move. I had believed her completely. Attorney Gerald Marsh slid the paperwork across his desk and explained that the liquid assets, the $2.3 million insurance payout, would be transferred directly to the joint account Diana and I had maintained since our wedding 6 years ago. Standard practice given the beneficiary designation, Gerald said, folding his hands. The funds should clear within 5 to 7 business days. I nodded. Diana squeezed my knee. I had trusted her with every molecule of my being. That's the thing I need you to understand before the rest of this story unfolds. Diana wasn't just my wife, she was the person I had structured my entire adult life around. When she launched her firm, I took a lower-paying position closer to home so I could handle household logistics while she scaled. When she needed a co-signer for her first major office lease, I put my name on the line without a second thought. When she worked until midnight 3 nights running, I kept dinner warm and asked no questions. I had loved her with a completeness that I now recognize as the very thing that made me vulnerable. For months before my father died, we had sat on our back porch on a warm November evening, and she had said, "I think we should try for a baby next year." I'd felt something warm and certain open up in my chest. I'd said, "I think so too." She'd leaned her head against my shoulder and we'd sat there until the stars came out. That was the woman I thought I knew. The funds cleared on a Friday. On Saturday morning, I was making coffee and Diana said she had to drive to her office, something about a server migration her team was monitoring. She kissed me on the cheek. She smelled like her usual perfume. I told her I'd have lunch ready when she got back. She didn't come back until nearly 4. I didn't think anything of it. I was used to her unpredictable hours. It was a Sunday evening, 9 days after my father's funeral, that I logged into our joint account to begin organizing finances for the estate settlement process. Gerald had asked me to pull together a summary of liquid assets for a follow-up meeting. I remember the page loading. I remember the number it showed. $4,847. $2.3 million had been wired out in 2 separate transfers, $1.4 million on Thursday evening, another $900,000 on Friday afternoon, the same day the insurance funds cleared. The receiving account was unfamiliar. The transfers were authorized using Diana's login credentials and confirmed via her phone. I sat there for a very long time. The coffee I'd made 20 minutes ago went cold on the desk. I kept refreshing the page as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. My first thought was that her accounts had been hacked. My second thought was that there had been some catastrophic error at the bank. My third thought arrived quietly, like a door swinging open onto a dark room I hadn't known existed behind the walls of my own house. I called her cell. She picked up on the third ring. "Hey, I'm just finishing up with a client recap. Can I call you back in? Where did the money go, Diana?" Silence. A silence so specific and heavy that it told me everything before she said a single word. "What do you mean?" $2.3 million, I said. My voice was steady in a way that surprised me. "My father's money. It's gone from our account. 2 wire transfers. Your credentials. Your phone confirmation. So I am asking you, very clearly, where did that money go?" Another pause. Then, "Tom, I can explain. Come home," I said. "Right now." I hung up and sat in the dark and felt the grief for my father, which had already been enormous, split open into something even larger and more terrible. Because now I was grieving 2 things at once. She was home in 20 minutes, which told me she hadn't been at a client meeting. She walked in through the front door and I was standing in the living room with all the lights on, the bank statements printed from my laptop and laid across the coffee table. I had also, in those 20 minutes, checked her email through the shared family account we used for household subscriptions. She'd forgotten I had the master password, and I had found enough. His name was Garrett Whitfield. He was a real estate developer she'd met at a conference in Austin 14 months ago. The emails went back 13 months. The money, I could now see from the forwarded wire confirmation in her personal sent folder, had gone to an account in his name, specifically, to fund the down payment on a commercial development property he was acquiring in Phoenix. She had taken my dead father's inheritance and wired it to her lover's real estate deal. I watched her face as she stepped into the living room and saw the papers on the table. She went very still. "Diana," I said. Tell me I'm misreading this. She didn't tell me I was misreading it. What she did was set her purse down slowly on the chair by the door, as if buying herself a few seconds, and then she said, "It's complicated." Something happened in me at those two words. Something that had been wound very, very tight simply snapped. Complicated, I repeated. My father died 9 days ago. We buried him. You held my hand at the graveside. And then you took the money he left me, money he spent 40 years building, and you wired it to the men you've been sleeping with for over a year. That is what you did. And your explanation is that it's complicated. Tom, how long? She hesitated. I told you. Garrett and I, don't say his name in this house. My voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. How long have you been lying to me? Every dinner, every conversation, every time you said you were working late, every time I told you I loved you and you said it back. How long has all of that been a performance? She started to cry. I had seen Diana cry exactly 4 times in 6 years. She was not a woman who cried easily, and I recognized that the tears were real, which paradoxically made me angrier. Real tears meant real feeling, and if she was capable of real feeling, then every choice she had made was a conscious one. 13 months, she said quietly. The emails start 13 months ago, I said. Are you telling me the emails are the beginning? She nodded. And the money? Walk me through it. Right now. Look me in the eye and explain to me how you decided to take my father's life insurance and send it to a real estate deal for the men you're sleeping with. She wiped her face. Garrett's deal was closing and he needed the down payment by end of week. I was going to replace it. I have a capital raise coming in next quarter. I was going to put it back before I what? I said. Before I noticed. That was your plan. That I wouldn't notice $2.3 million was missing from our account. I panicked. The timing, stop. I held up one hand. Stop explaining the logistics. I want you to hear what you did. My father died. He spent his life building something so that I would be taken care of after he was gone. He trusted you. He liked you. He used to call you, my daughter-in-law Diana, like that was a thing he was proud of. And while I was grieving him, you took what he left me and you handed it to another man. She was sobbing now. I felt nothing toward those tears. That absence of feeling frightened me a little. I had loved this woman, and somewhere in the last 30 minutes the love had not diminished so much as been revealed to have been resting on a foundation that no longer existed. I want you out of this house tonight, I said. Tom, please, I'm calling a locksmith tomorrow morning. Whatever you need for the next few days, take it now. Don't call me unless it's through an attorney. You can't just, I can, I said. And I am. Get out, Diana. She left at 11 p.m. with a rolling suitcase and her laptop bag. I stood in the kitchen after I heard her car pull out of the driveway and I put both hands flat on the counter and I breathed. Then I picked up my phone and called my friend Nathan Voss, who had been my college roommate and was now a corporate attorney, and I told him everything. Nathan's voice was calm and immediate. Don't touch the account. Don't move anything. Send me screenshots of every transaction and every email you have right now. And don't talk to her again without me on the line. She took my father's money, Nathan. I know, he said. And we're going to get it back. I didn't sleep that night. What I did instead was build a file. I sat at my desk from midnight until 6 in the morning and I documented everything. Every email, every transfer record, every date, every lie I could now retrospectively identify. The conference in Austin where she'd first met Garrett Whitfield. The week in April she said she was at a digital strategy summit in Denver, which I now cross-referenced against her email and confirmed she had actually spent with him in Sedona. The client dinners that had run suspiciously long. The Saturday morning server migrations. I printed everything and organized it into a binder with labeled tabs, and as dawn came through the kitchen window I felt the grief inside me harden into something cold and purposeful. I was going to get my father's money back. And I was going to make absolutely certain that every person in Diana's professional and personal world understood exactly what she had done with it. Nathan arrived at my house Monday morning with coffee and a yellow legal pad. He had called a forensic accountant he worked with named Carol Briggs, who was joining us by phone. We sat at my kitchen table and laid out the structure of the situation. The wire transfer, Nathan explained, was potentially criminal. She moved funds from a joint account without your knowledge or consent to benefit a third party, specifically, a romantic partner. Depending on how Garrett received and used those funds, you may be looking at civil fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conversion. The fact that she used your father's inheritance makes this significantly more egregious in terms of damages and intent. Carol Briggs's voice came through the phone speaker. The key is whether we can establish that Whitfield knew the origin of those funds. If he knew the money came from a joint marital account and that the other spouse hadn't authorized the transfer, he could be liable as a recipient of fraudulently transferred funds. Can we freeze the Phoenix account? I asked. We can file for an emergency injunction to freeze the assets related to that property deal before it closes, Nathan said. If the deal hasn't closed yet, we might be able to prevent those funds from being absorbed into a real estate transaction that would be much harder to unwind. I called Gerald Marsh, my father's attorney, while Nathan started drafting the injunction paperwork. Gerald was quiet for a long moment when I explained what had happened. Then he said, "Thomas, your father trusted that woman. He told me once that he was glad you'd found her." There was genuine anger in his voice, which I appreciated. "I'll send you a written statement confirming the purpose and origin of those funds. That will support your legal position that this was an inheritance, not marital property commingled over time." That statement, it turned out, would be critical. While Nathan worked the legal channels, I did something else. I called Diana's business partner, a woman named Christine, who had co-founded the consulting firm with her 8 years ago and who I had always genuinely liked. Christine answered on the second ring. "Thomas, I heard you two were having some trouble. I'm so sorry about your father. I meant to reach out." "Christine," I said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly. Has Diana moved any company funds recently that seemed irregular to you? Any capital she may have described as a bridge loan or short-term liquidity maneuver?" Silence. Christine. "Thomas, there was a discussion about a short-term facility last month. She said it was for a client infrastructure build and that it would be repaid within 30 days. I had some concerns, but she's the managing partner and how much?" Another pause. 200,000. I closed my eyes. She hadn't just taken my father's money. She'd taken company funds as well, likely to supplement what she needed to send to Garrett before the insurance payout even cleared. That meant the theft was premeditated. She had been moving money toward this deal for weeks. "Christine," I said carefully, "I think you need to get your own attorney. Today. And I think you should audit every company account going back 6 months." I heard her intake of breath. "Oh my God. I'm sorry," I said. "I genuinely am. You didn't deserve this either." The emergency injunction came through faster than I expected. Nathan had a judge's emergency hearing slot by Tuesday afternoon, and by Wednesday morning the Phoenix property account was frozen pending litigation. Garrett Whitfield, who apparently had not yet been informed of what was happening, attempted to close on the commercial property on Wednesday and was notified by the title company that there was a legal hold on the transaction. His attorney called Nathan's office within 2 hours. Nathan relayed the conversation to me with barely contained satisfaction. Whitfield's attorney is claiming his client received the funds as a personal loan from Diana and had no knowledge they came from marital assets. We expected that. But here's the interesting part. When I mentioned that we also have evidence suggesting Whitfield may have encouraged Diana to access those funds after the funeral, his attorney got very quiet. "Do we have that evidence?" I asked. "We have an email from Whitfield to Diana dated the day after your father passed, saying, and I'm reading directly here, the deal closes in 2 weeks. You said you had access to resources. Now's the time. Sent the day after your father's death, the day after my father's death. While I was making phone calls to relatives and Diana was sitting beside me on the couch telling me she loved me, she had received that email and had made her decision." I said nothing for a moment. Nathan let the silence sit. "Bury him," I said finally. "That's the plan," Nathan said. I contacted the Real Estate Developers Association board, of which Garrett Whitfield was a listed member, and submitted a formal complaint with supporting documentation. I then contacted 3 journalists who covered business and financial fraud for regional outlets. I'd done my research, found the ones who had previously written about wire fraud and fiduciary misconduct, and sent each of them a carefully worded letter with the factual summary and a note that I was available for comment. I wasn't looking for sensationalism. I was looking for a matter of public record. My father's friend, a man named Douglas Whitaker who sat on the board of the Regional Chamber of Commerce, had known Raymond Cole for 30 years. I called Douglas and told him the full story. Douglas listened without interrupting. At the end, he said, "Your father would have been furious." Then he said, "Whitfield spoke at our spring conference last year. I'll make sure he isn't invited to anything we're associated with going forward, and I'll make sure people know why." The business community in our city was not large. Word moved through it like water. Meanwhile, the divorce attorney Nathan referred me to, a formidably focused woman named Patricia Owens, had filed the divorce petition citing financial fraud and dissipation of marital assets. The filing was public record. It named specific figures. It named the receiving party. By the end of the second week, Garrett Whitfield's firm had lost 2 partnership agreements. I know this because one of the partners who walked away called Nathan's office to confirm the factual record before making his decision. He wanted to make sure he had the story right. He did. Diana's situation was deteriorating on a parallel track. Christine's emergency audit had confirmed the $200,000 in company funds had been moved without board authorization. Christine, on the advice of her attorney, had removed Diana from the firm's operating accounts and convened an emergency partner meeting. Diana was placed on administrative leave from her own company pending the audit's completion. The company's legal counsel was exploring whether to pursue her independently. I heard most of this secondhand, through Nathan, and occasionally through mutual friends who called me with a kind of careful discomfort, as if they weren't sure whether to give me information or condolences. I usually said, "Tell me everything. I'm not fragile." The one call I did not expect came from Garrett Whitfield himself. My phone rang on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after I'd discovered the transfers. "Unknown number," I answered. "Thomas," said a voice I'd never heard before. Smooth, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to negotiating. "My name is Garrett Whitfield. I think it's time we talk directly." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, "given that my attorney has advised me not to, and given that you're the man my wife sent my dead father's money to. But I'm curious what you wanted to say." A brief pause. He had expected something different, I think, more heat, maybe, or more willingness to engage. "I want you to know I didn't know the full picture of where those funds originated. Diana represented them as her own capital from the firm. Your email to her the day after my father's death suggests you knew she was going to access resources she didn't yet have," I said, "which a reasonable person might interpret as pressure." "That's one reading. It's the reading a judge will use," I said. "My attorney will be in touch with yours about the settlement terms. I'd recommend your attorney take those calls seriously." I hung up. He called back twice. I didn't answer. The injunction held. The Phoenix deal collapsed when the title company refused to proceed with a frozen account and an active fraud litigation. Whitfield's development firm took a significant financial hit. They'd already committed resources to the project that they couldn't recover. I later learned, through the journalist who did eventually run a piece about the case, that 2 of his major investors had pulled out of an unrelated project as a result of the publicity. Carol Briggs, the forensic accountant, traced every dollar. The $1.4 million first transfer was still fully accessible in the frozen account. The $900,000 second transfer had been partially spent, closing costs for the property deposit, Whitfield's attorney fees, and some cash transfers that required subpoenas to trace. We recovered $847,000 of the $900,000 through the litigation settlement. The remaining $53,000 was absorbed into legal costs and proved unrecoverable in practical terms, but Nathan assured me the overall recovery was far better than these cases typically yielded. Total recovery, just under $2.25 million of the $2.3 million, plus the $200,000 Christine's firm pursued against Diana separately through their own litigation. Patricia Owens, my divorce attorney, was relentless. She was a small woman in her late 50s who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by human behavior. In our depositions and filings, she established clearly that the insurance payout had been designated specifically to Thomas Raymond Cole as a beneficiary, my full legal name, and that while the funds had passed through a joint account, their origin and purpose were documented and traceable. Gerald Marsh's affidavit was precise and damning. The dissipation of those assets in the manner Diana had employed was financial misconduct under the state's marital law, and it dramatically altered the division of other marital assets in my favor. Diana tried, through her attorney, to argue that she'd intended to repay the funds before I noticed, as if the intent to restore a theft retroactively excused the theft. Patricia described this argument to me with a dry expression and said, "We've heard this before. It doesn't work." It didn't work. The divorce settlement awarded me the marital home, a favorable split of our joint investments, and a structured judgment against Diana personally for the damages exceeding what was recovered from Whitfield's accounts. She would be paying that judgment for years. I want to be honest about the months that followed, because I think pretending they were easy would be dishonest in a different way than Diana had been dishonest, but dishonest nonetheless. I was a man whose father had just died and whose wife had just betrayed him in the same month, and there were mornings when getting out of bed felt like moving through something thick and resistant. I went to a therapist named Dr. Alan Forte, who had an office near downtown with a plant he clearly overwatered and a bookshelf organized by color instead of subject, and I sat in the chair across from him twice a week and talked through what had happened. "You're allowed to be angry," he said in our third session, when I'd apologized for the heat in my voice. "You're also allowed to be sad. The two aren't in competition." He was right. I was both, for a long time. The anger was hot and specific, it had targets, it had edges. The grief was formless and deep, and it was for my father as much as for the marriage, and sometimes I couldn't tell them apart. I spent a lot of time in my father's workshop that spring. He had a garage space where he'd kept his tools and his old drafting table, and I'd put it off for months, but eventually I started going in there on Saturday mornings and just being among his things. I fixed the back fence, which he'd always meant to fix. I reorganized his tool wall. I found a box of photographs from the early years of his business, before I was born, and I sat on the concrete floor for an hour and looked at pictures of a young man I barely recognized building something from nothing. I understood for the first time, sitting there, what those 40 years had actually meant. He hadn't just been making money, he'd been making something he could hand forward, something that would outlast him. I made a decision that spring. I took a portion of the recovered funds and, with Gerald Marsh's guidance, established a small foundation in my father's name, the Raymond Cole Skilled Trades Scholarship, which would fund vocational education for students who wanted to go into manufacturing and trades. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was quiet, and it felt right, and the first time I sat in on the scholarship committee selection meeting and saw the applicants' files, I felt something shift in me that I hadn't been able to shift with anger alone. I also, around that time, started running. I'd always been reasonably fit but had let it slide in the last couple of years of the marriage, accommodating Diana's schedule, putting things aside. I started at 3 miles and built to 8 over the course of the summer. By July I was running before dawn, in the empty streets with the sky turning pale at the edges, and I started to feel, physically, like myself again, like someone who inhabited his own body with intention. Work helped. I'd always been good at my job. I was a senior project manager at an infrastructure consulting firm, but I had held myself back in certain ways, keeping a certain ceiling on ambition to remain available for Diana's needs. That spring I accepted a project lead position on a major regional contract I'd previously deflected. By fall I was overseeing a team of 12 and delivering results that my director called the best work our division had produced in 5 years. By the following February, I was promoted to division director. The promotion dinner my team threw me was at a restaurant downtown, and they'd made a cake that said, Division Director, in blue frosting, and I laughed genuinely for what felt like the first time in a long time, and I thought, my father would have liked this. I met someone in October, though I want to be precise about that. Meeting someone is different from it becoming something. Her name was Claire, and she worked in landscape architecture, and I met her at a fundraiser for the Scholarship Foundation. She was talking to Gerald Marsh when I arrived, and she laughed at something he said, and it was a real laugh, not a performed one, and I noticed it because real things were something I'd become very attuned to. We had coffee twice before I told her, plainly, that I was less than a year out of a difficult divorce and that I was genuinely not sure what I had to offer in terms of availability. She said she appreciated the honesty and that she wasn't in a rush. We had dinner once after that, and then twice, and by December something had settled between us that felt real, patient, unhurried. She asked questions about my father with genuine curiosity and listened when I answered. She never asked about Diana. I wasn't fully healed. I knew I wasn't. But I was moving in a direction, which was more than I could say for the gray months after the discovery. And then, in February, almost a year to the month after I'd found the bank statement, I saw Diana. I was coming out of a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, travel mug in hand, early for a meeting. She was on the sidewalk 20 feet away, coming out of a dry cleaner's, and we nearly walked into each other. She looked diminished. That was the word that occurred to me, and I didn't feel satisfaction exactly, more like the quiet recognition of a true thing. She'd lost weight she hadn't needed to lose. Her hair, which she'd always kept with meticulous precision, was shorter and not recently styled. She was wearing a coat I recognized from years ago that she'd complained was out of date. She looked like someone who had been under sustained pressure for a long time and was showing it. I was told later by a colleague who happened to be walking past and witnessed the whole thing without either of us knowing, like I was in a good coat on a crisp morning carrying coffee and looking like someone whose life had direction. I don't know if that's accurate. It's what she told me. Diana stopped. She said my name, Thomas. I stopped. I looked at her. She said, I've wanted to reach out. I know that probably isn't what you want to hear, but there are things I wanted to say. All right, I said. I wasn't unkind. I was just present and unmoved, like watching weather through glass. I'm sorry. She said it like a sentence with weight behind it, not a reflex. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it probably doesn't mean much at this point, but I am. For all of it. For your father, and for what I did, and for who I was in that period. I was not a good person. I know that. I looked at her for a moment. On the street, people moved past us in both directions. Where's Whitfield? I asked. She gave a short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He ended things when the Phoenix deal fell apart. Apparently I was more useful to him as an asset source than as a person. She paused. His attorney called mine last fall to discuss the settlement. I think that's the last time his name came up in my life. I nodded slowly. I had already known most of this. News moved the way news moves. I lost the firm, she said. Or, I didn't lose it. Christine bought out my share as part of the settlement. I'm consulting independently now. She paused. It's smaller. I'm sorry about that, I said. And I found that I meant it in a distant way, not the kind of sorry that contains any desire to alter things, but the kind that simply acknowledges that consequences are real and sometimes total. She looked at me. You look well, Thomas. I am, I said. I'm genuinely well. The foundation, I heard about the scholarship. Or your father. Something shifted in her face. He would have liked that. I think so too, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer, and I could see, clearly, that she was deciding whether to say something, to reach further, to ask for something. And then I watched her decide not to. Maybe she saw something in my expression. Maybe she simply understood, finally, what the last year had made permanent. Take care of yourself, I said. I meant it the same way I'd meant the sorry, not cold, just completed. I walked away. I didn't look back. Not because I was performing anything, there was no audience, or at least I didn't know there was one, but because there simply wasn't anything behind me I needed to see. The coffee in my hand was warm. The morning was cold and clear. I had a meeting in 12 minutes and work I cared about waiting for me on the other side of it. That afternoon I called Claire and told her about the encounter, because that was the kind of relationship we were building, one built on telling things, on not having a self that existed separately from the person I was with. She listened. Then she said, "How are you feeling?" "Clear," I said. And that was exactly right. Not happy in some artificial, revenge-complete way. Not triumphant. Just clear. Like a room after the windows have been opened. I think often about my father, and what he would say about all of it. Raymond Cole was not a sentimental man, but he was a precise one. He believed that things should work the way they were supposed to work, and that when they didn't, you diagnosed the problem and fixed it. I think he would have been furious about what happened. I think he would have approved of how I handled it. And I think he would have told me, in his direct and undecorated way, to stop looking backward. I hear he moved on from Phoenix, that Whitfield relocated to another city to rebuild, that his reputation in this market never recovered. Someone mentioned it in passing at a chamber event and I said, and moved on to the next conversation. That's the honest truth of how much room he takes up in my life now. The Raymond Cole Skilled Trades Scholarship has, in its first 2 years, funded 11 students. One of them sent me a handwritten note after her first semester, telling me about what she was learning in her welding certification program, describing the way metal behaves under heat with a kind of wonder that made me think of my father in that garage, hands on something he was building from raw material into a finished thing. I keep the note in my desk drawer. Some mornings I take it out and read it. That, more than any legal victory or recovered dollar figure or moment of watching Diana's face on a sidewalk absorb the reality of what she'd lost, that note, and what it represents, is the thing I'd point to if you asked me where my father's money ultimately went. Not to a real estate deal in Phoenix. Not to a man who saw my wife as an asset source. Not lost in the machinery of betrayal and litigation. It went forward, into someone's future, into something that works. My father spent 40 years building something he could hand forward. I lost it for 9 days. And then I clawed it back and I made it mean something. That's the whole story. That's how it ends. Not with fire, not with ruin, though there was plenty of both in the middle, but with a scholarship committee and a woman who laughs like she means it and runs in the morning when the sky is still pale and the city is quiet and everything ahead of me is open. I am Raymond Cole's son. I know how to build things that last.